person, and that we'll be able to continue both on Zoom and in person. I want to thank the Meet the Author Committee, who spent an intense month before the season started, reading over 60 books in 1 month in order to make selections for this year. And I'd also like to thank the B'nai Sholem Beth El Foundation, which has supported Meet the Author since its inception. I'd also like to thank our members from Congregation Torah El and the local community who've been very loyal to the program, as well as women who are with us from across the country from Women's League for Conservative Judaism. I also want to thank Temple Beth Sholem in Manalapan, Congregation Avahat Olam in Howell, Temple Beth An in Aberdeen, and Congregation B'nai Israel in Rumson, all of whom have shared our program with their congregations. Tonight's author, Gabrielle Glaser, is an investigative journalist and New York Times bestselling author whose work on mental health, medicine, and culture has appeared in the New York Times, the New York Times Sunday Magazine, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and many other publications. She grew up in Oregon, has a bachelor's and master's degree from Stanford University in history, and I think you can clearly see her historical training in the book, and currently lives in New Jersey with her husband and 3 children. Gabrielle is a writer who challenges conventional wisdom on many subjects that touch people's lives. I took that quote directly from her website, and I think it's very true. If you go to her website and you click on some of her examples of her writing there, you'll see what I'm talking about. 2 of her previous books are Her Best Kept Secret, Why Women Drink and How They Can Regain Control, and Strangers to the Tribe, which is about interfaith marriage. I know from listening to her at Jewish Book Council conference and from talking to her on the phone where we had a lively conversation, that she's a compelling speaker who's not only eloquent, but feels passionately about those things that she writes about. Tonight, Gabrielle's going to talk about her latest book, American Baby, A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption. I mentioned to her on the phone that I read the book twice, loving it both times. First, I paid more attention to Margaret and Stephen's story because I wanted to know what happened at the end. And then I went back again and absorbed the history that was part of the book. And as I said both times, thought it was wonderful. Please let me remind everyone to stay muted during the program, and that if you have any questions for Gabrielle, please put them in the chat. You can do that if you're on a computer. Go to the bottom of your screen, click on chat. You'll see a box come up on the right. You can type in your question and then just click enter, and it will get sent to all of us, and we will go through the questions at the end of the program. In our chat, you're also going to see a link to our Temple website for those of you who are not Temple members and who have enjoyed our programs over the year or years since COVID began. We do welcome any donations that you might like to make that will help support us. We are grant funded, as I said. So with that, Gabrielle, I'm going to turn the program over to you and maybe start with this question. Can you give us an overview of the book to help us get some perspective about the book as a whole and also about the narrative arc of David and Margaret?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that, Allison. And everybody, thank you so much for having me. I'm really, truly honored to be among you tonight. My volume is up as high as possible. Can you hear me? Should I?
Yes.
Should I shout? Okay. I hate to shout, but so I'm honored to be among you. Thank you very much for that warm welcome. I must point out that my 3 children are all grown and out of the house. The youngest is a sophomore in college, so I need to change that if that's on my website. I got started by writing this book in 2007. I was a newspaper reporter in my home state of Oregon, and I met David Rosenberg, who was an adopted cantor at a traditional synagogue in Portland, who needed a kidney and was getting a kidney from a fellow congregant and a close friend. And the first time I met David, he told me that he hoped the story that I was writing, it was a story for Rosh Hashanah. It was a pretty standard kind of boilerplate, feel good story for a mostly non-Jewish audience about Tikkun Olam. And the very first time I met David, he told me that he hoped the story would go viral and that he hoped his birth mother would see it and recognize him as her son. That didn't happen because of secrecy laws that exist in the United States about adoption. And I'll get to that a little bit later. But 7 years later, I got a phone call from David, who by then I had moved from Portland, Oregon to New Jersey. And 7 years later, I got a phone call from David in which he said, "Are you sitting down? I found my birth mother and she lives 45 minutes from you." And during the course of that conversation, David said that they had this 52 year separation, that his birth mother had always wanted him, that she had married his birth father, that they had gone on to have 3 more children, and that an entire story, the narrative that David had David Rosenberg, which was his adoptive name, the narrative that David Rosenberg had internalized, that had been given to him by society, by the adoption community, by the adoption agency, had completely reversed itself. He had always believed that he had been an inconvenience to his birth mother, that he had been given up because he was unwanted, and that was really all there was to the story. He had been adopted by 2 people, and it's important to state this at the outset, that he'd been adopted by a couple who loved him very much, and he them, but he never understood his origin story. He didn't know where it began. He didn't have his biological history. We're Jewish people, that matters to us, and he had been cut off from that for his entire life. And in 2014, after a DNA test had reunited him with his birth mother, Margaret Earl Katz, he had a request for me, knowing my work as an investigative journalist, knowing my work as a book writer. And he said, do one thing, examine the secrecy that kept me apart from my birth family my entire life. It's also important to note that 3 months after David Rosenberg met Margaret Earl Katz and his baby sister. Again, as I said, David was a cantor. His baby sister is an opera singer. She happened to live in Berlin at the time and had assignments all over the great opera houses of Europe. And David said, make sure this doesn't happen to anybody else. This shouldn't have happened. I could have met these people, my kin, much sooner. He died 3 months after their first and only meeting in July of 2014 of the very illnesses about which Margaret Earl Katz had tried to spend her entire life warning him. And the adoption agency in New York City never passed on those messages. So the arc of the story, to answer Allison's question, goes into the twin narratives of mother and son. But it also tells a much larger story that was happening in the United States at that time. Margaret Earl Katz was one of an estimated 4 million young women who got pregnant as an unwed young girl in an era after the war, after World War II, during which there was no sex education, there was virtually no birth control, even for many married couples, and certainly there was no legal abortion until 1973. She was forced by society, by her family, by conservative mores at the time, and in fact, New York state law, which forbade premarital sex. It actually was illegal to have premarital sex in New York state until 1971. All of these factors forced her to surrender this child into a very coercive, lucrative, and predatory adoption system. So I tell the very close, granular narrative of mother and son, and how David's life went on, and what happened to Margaret, what happened to George Katz, her boyfriend and later husband, and what was happening in the adoption world at the time. The demand for babies was enormous in the years after World War II. If one couldn't conceive during a period in which the goal was for all families to have babies and as many as possible, to join that big demographic boom of the baby boom, then the only alternative, or not the almost the only alternative for couples who were unable to conceive, was to turn to the nationwide adoption system that was flourishing from state to state, and which operated under the guise of secrecy. And I can explain this a little bit later in more detail, but due to just starting in the 1930s, I'll get to some of the reasons later. Starting in the 1930s, starting in California, passing along to New York, and 46 other states, so 48 states in all. When a child was surrendered for adoption, he or she was issued an original birth certificate that remained sealed to all but state and adoption officials, and an amended birth certificate was issued in its place, listing the child's adoptive name and along with his or her adoptive parents as if the child had been born to them. And the reasons behind this were fourfold. Number one, it was to try to protect the child from the shame of his or her illegitimacy. It was to shield the mother from the stigma of having had a child out of wedlock. And three, it was to reassure adoptive parents that no birth family would ever come to try to interfere with their newly created family after suffering years of, perhaps years of infertility. But the roots of that, as some of you know from having read the book, really were deeply entrenched in a system of baby stealing and baby selling that began in the 1920s, starting in Memphis starting in 1924. And I think that's kind of a long wind up. I hope I answered your questions, Allison. You're muted. I can't hear you. You're muted.
Okay. Do you want to get started with your talk by reading a section of the book?
I'd be happy to. So here's a section of, it's early in the book. It's called This Never Happened. The chapter is called This Never Happened, and it describes the pressure under which Margaret was put when she was forced into.
No, don't touch that.
When she was forced into surrendering her son. She had been put away in a maternity home for Jewish girls. By the way, in New York State at the time, all adoptions were regulated by the religion of the birth mother. So Margaret, as a young Jewish woman, was sent to the Jewish adoption agency, Louise Wise Services. Similar things happened to Catholic women who went to Catholic charities, and Protestant women went to a variety of different Protestant agencies. But in Margaret's case, she had been at a Jewish maternity home, given birth by herself, strapped down, knocked out, and not allowed to hold her baby. She and George were still somehow, the finality of adoption was never explained to them, and they somehow believed as young teenage lovers that they were going to, if they could just prove their fitness to city social workers, they would be able to maintain custody of their son. When the little boy they named Stephen was about 5.5 months old, Margaret and George came to a large building in downtown Manhattan with a baby rattle and a sweater and a hat and booties that Margaret had knit for their son. They also had an array of Polaroid photographs that George had taken. He was he was a gifted pitcher who had a college scholarship to go off and be a pitcher at Ohio State, and he used his arm at arcades throughout New York City to try to win home goods as an 18-year-old boy, to win home goods, then take Polaroid photographs of them in order to be able to convince social workers that even though Margaret and he were teenagers, she was only 17, they could be good parents. Look, we have a blender. Look, we have cutlery. Look, we have Corningware. So just keep that visual in your mind. This young couple is entering into this building in May of 1962 to try to glimpse their son, who is in foster care being observed. And social workers use that opportunity to threaten Margaret for the umpteenth time with wanting her to sign papers. So here's how that went down. The woman pushed some forms across the desk and looked Margaret in the eye. If you don't sign these papers right now, your child will stay in foster care for God knows how long. Margaret shook her head. You've got nothing to offer him, the social worker said. This nice Jewish family will give him a wonderful life with every comfort. Still, Margaret refused. You're a minor, the woman insisted. You've got nothing to offer him. The more Margaret resisted, the more dire the social worker's threats became. She sat for what felt like hours, but the clock on the wall above the woman's head revealed that she'd only been in the office for 10 minutes. I'm not signing anything, she said repeatedly. She crossed her arms in front of her chest. I'm keeping my baby. The woman took a deep draw on her cigarette and blew smoke directly toward Margaret. She smiled, a pursed-lipped smile. Oh, really? She said. You go right ahead and refuse. She glanced down at Margaret's file, leaned across the desk, and changed tactics. Would you like to know what could happen to you, Miss Earle? She inhaled again. If you don't sign these papers, we'll make you a ward of the state. She crushed her cigarette out in the heavy glass ashtray. We can put you in juvenile hall, she said, narrowing her eyes. Think of how that will look for your parents. First, the pregnancy. Want to get locked up now, too? The threat was not idle. Under 19th century laws known as wayward minor codes, juveniles whose actions fell under the general rubric of deviant were often committed to reformatory institutions. The long list of vague, punishable offenses included deliberate disobedience to the reasonable and lawful commands of a parent, associating with disorderly persons and moral depravity, under which willful premarital intercourse most certainly fell. The social worker stared at Margaret as she pulled out another cigarette and flicked the brass lighter open again. She clicked the top of her heavy ballpoint pen, inched the papers even closer to Margaret's side of the desk. Margaret felt like she was going to be sick. It was enough to have shamed her family and herself with the baby. But the threat of juvie, where the authorities sent serial shoplifters, young prostitutes, and kids in gangs, was too terrible to contemplate. After everything she'd been through, this one hit home. What good could she be to her son if she was locked away? She felt the tears come, a year's worth of humiliation, guilt, and fear. Then she took the ballpoint pen from the social worker and scrawled her signature. Although Margaret understood fundamentally that she was surrendering custody of her son, she did not imagine that with the stroke of her pen, she was irreversibly severing all legal claims as Stephen's mother. She clung to the fantasy that the decision could be reversed. Stephen would spend a few months with the diplomat's family and then could be returned to her and George once they were married. She was promised that he was going to a diplomat's family that week. She didn't read the dreaded document carefully. Tears flooded so profusely she couldn't see the words, and no one, certainly not the social worker, certainly not an attorney, explained that it was irrevocable. She wasn't even given a copy of what she had agreed to. I'm skipping ahead. Margaret had been raised to believe that God would take care of her if she did the right thing. And until that moment, she believed that this nice Jewish adoption agency, her own community, her own people, would help her and George to raise their baby, a gift from God himself. Suddenly, she found herself asking, where is he? Looking down at the paper she'd signed, she felt the stubborn optimism to which she'd clung, cratering underneath her. What if there's an emergency? She asked the woman, her face flushing. If there's anything medical, the social worker answered, tell the agency and they'll tell his parents. She snuffed out her cigarette and moved the papers Margaret had signed to her side of the desk. The social worker stood up, the heels of her pumps clicking on the tiles. She opened the door and waved for Margaret to leave. Stephen had long since been delivered back to his foster mother, and George was waiting for her in the hallway. As soon as Margaret saw him, she buried her face in his broad chest, crying so hard she got his shirt wet. He pulled out a handkerchief. "What is it, Margaret?" he implored. She couldn't get the words out. "They made me sign the papers," she said. "They told me if I didn't, they'd send me to juvie." George took her by the hand to the subway and wrapped his arms around her. His own hand shaking, he withdrew a Polaroid that he'd taken of Stephen while Margaret was signing away her parental rights. In it, the 5-month-old baby looks at his father, grinning toothlessly as he grabs his feet. A shock of black hair covers his head, and his black eyes dance, delighted. George stroked Margaret's hair and murmured that everything would be all right. "How?" she exclaimed. "They're taking him." So that was the last time Margaret Earl Katz saw her son until he was 52 years old. And as I mentioned in that passage, she tried everything she could to try to convey to the adoption agency in New York City every single time there was an illness. She obviously married her baby's father. She took care of her own aging, sick parents, and she knew all of the diseases that laced through the family tree. With great trepidation, with shame, with great pain. Remember, she was told, she was told, "You are a no good Nick. This baby is going to go to another family who deserves to raise him. You can go on one day and have children of your own." And the one thing the social worker promised her is that they would pass on, that the Louise Wise agency would pass on medical information. It passed on not news about diabetes, not news about a variety of different cancers, not news of a variety of different autoimmune diseases, nothing. And that it was a shock when Margaret did get the phone call from her son in May of 2014 that his voice was weak and almost, it was barely audible. He had a lethal form of thyroid cancer, but he had suffered from diabetes. He had suffered from a host of other illnesses that had afflicted George as well. And so one thing that I'd like to say about that is that a lot of people believed at the time, and the narrative of adoption at the time was that it was for the best. It worked out the best for every single party. It worked out the best for the adoptee who was going to a married couple. It worked out the best for the birth mother who didn't have to carry around the shame of having gotten pregnant out of wedlock. And certainly it allowed couples who were trying to conceive to start a family. But what that narrative didn't ever convey was the loss that a birth mother felt and a birth father felt, and the loss of information, most importantly, of information that adoptees experienced and continue to experience. And that's, I think, probably a great place for us to start conversing more readily. Right, Ellison?
That sounds good. I know that there are some people who have questions, and I have many of my own, but I'm going to start with others. So I'm going to start with some questions from Neil Weizenkorn. And for those of you in the audience, if you have questions, please put them into the chat. Neil said the following: "The early days of adoption as portrayed in the book were unfeeling, brutal, difficult, demanding, and almost slave-like." Neil's not one for hyperbole, right? I would hope that things have changed now that we're in the third decade of the 21st century. Is this true? And do you think it has now changed for the better?
Oh, Neil, I wish I could say that it has. I think there is a sort of glossier image of adoption today because it typically is more open, and today birth mothers are allowed to, for the most part, in domestic adoptions, birth mothers are allowed to select the couples with whom they want to place their children rather than having social workers behind the scenes decide a child's fate secretly. But and this is a big but, there are many women who are trafficked to the United States for the sole purpose of bearing a child on American soil. And I'm investigating that right now, so I don't want to say too much more, but I'm sure you know of maybe you all heard of the story of the Marshall Islands, the women from the Marshall Islands who've been trafficked here for in order to give birth, and they've been kept essentially as chattel slaves. So I wish I could say, oh yeah, it's totally different, but I've been disabused of that notion for the last in the year and year plus since this book came out. So regrettably, no.
Um, I think all of us who read this book, even if we have not given up a child, were incredibly moved by it. But you as a mother, what was it like for you to hear Margaret's story? Because it was a long story.
Yeah, it was a long story, and it was a long story that had not necessarily been fully processed. And I'll tell you, Allison, you and I had a conversation in which we talked a little bit about this. And the distance between my house and Margaret's house is 45 minutes on the turnpike on a good day without, if I would hit it right with no traffic. But invariably I'd stay longer at Margaret's house. This was all pre-COVID. We would go out for lunch, and sometimes a couple times I'd take her to get our nails done, and usually when I would hit a certain exit on the way back, her exit is exit 8, and mine, I live up the Garden State Parkway. I live in Montclair, and usually by the time I would get on the turnpike and just merge and get onto traffic, I would feel the tears come. And I wasn't really, see, they're sort of coming now. I wasn't really aware of the totality of the story that she was telling me, because each day we would go, and I spent hundreds of hours with her. I saw her dozens of times. Each day there would be another whole chapter that she hadn't told me. For example, the Corningware. When one of the first few times I went to her house, I felt like I was going to my Nana's house. I smelled the same brownies and Folgers that I would smell at my own late Nana's house. And when Margaret took the brownies out of the oven, she took them out in the same Corningware dish that I grew up with, that I always saw at my Nana's house. And I said, oh my God, I haven't seen one of those in 30 years, 20 years. How did you, I can't believe you still have it. And she told the story of George winning that Corningware as an 18-year-old boy, and then taking Polaroids of it to convince the social workers. Mm. So even though they didn't have their son with them, they had these emblems. The house was full of these reminders, of these items from an arcade in Coney Island or Far Rockaway, you name it, that this couple so devoted to their family, their nascent family, had kept among them. And I don't think she saw the symbolism of that. Oh, no baby, but we have the Corningware. And also, for those of you who read the book, you know that George was the son of 2 Holocaust survivors, and Margaret was the daughter of refugees from Nazi Germany. So I remember, and I know this is a really long answer to your question, but coming home one day, the day that she told me about the Corningware, which was surrounding her. And then she took out the blender. She had kept all this stuff. None of us keep all that stuff. We get better new stuff. But that was a tangible reminder of how hard they worked to try to keep their son. And I remember thinking about those dishes and the cutlery and the cake cutter, the cake, what do you call that? Cake knife.
Yeah.
Cake. I remember thinking, I have these 3 daughters who I bore, got to hold, got to name, got to keep with me in the hospital, got to nurse, got to cherish. I got to take them home, and nobody blinked an eye that I had these children I got to take home. And what was so shocking for me was how much for granted I took that.
Mm. I know you did a lot of research. I wonder if you can tell us about how many, well, it's really a double question. Number one, how many women did you interview and what was the research process like? And then the second part of it is, as painful as it was for Margaret, do you think it was made any easier by the fact that she and George did get married? Because for so many of the women, the father of their child disappeared. So I'll leave you with both of those questions, perhaps.
The first question, once I knew that I wanted to write a story about this woman's heroism and what had happened to her as a stand-in for what had happened to so many millions of other women, of course I knew that I needed to interview more women. And I would say all told, probably close to 100 other women. And it was kind of difficult because when you're talking to someone about these traumatic experiences, and then I was always very clear, look, this book is about one person and her son, but I'm speaking to you because I want to hear about your experience, and I want to hear about what happened to you in your maternity home. I want to hear what happened to you with your family. I want to hear what happened to you with your birth experience. It's hard when not everybody's story can go into a book, but the answer is close to 100. And your second question was, yes, without a doubt, Margaret always saw it as a deep, profound blessing that she and George loved each other very much. They did go on to get married and have 3 other children who they raised together until George's death, also far too early. As a 56-year-old man, I believe he died in 2000, maybe 2001. Anyway, early on in this century. And yes, most women I spoke to, and in fact, the experiences of the vast majority of women to whom this happened, were not able or didn't desire or to stay with the fathers of their babies. And that made the I think that made the process all the more lonely, all the more isolating, all the more traumatizing, in fact.
I know, of course, that you're a historian by academic training, but you could have just written a book about Margaret's experience or David's experience. What made you decide to include the very in-depth history that you did about adoption, sex ed, birth control, et cetera, because it's a pretty complete history of the time in those regards.
Well, I think because I am an historian, my idea of a great time is to listen to history podcasts. I'm listening to a ton of them about Ukraine right now. I can recommend some later if anybody's interested.
We're all interested.
Yeah, there's a podcast called The Rest is History. It's fantastic. You should write it down and listen to what these guys, they're British and they're brilliant. And I cannot recommend them highly enough. So here's another long answer to your question. I was born in the mid 1960s, and I grew up around, I had adopted neighbors, I had adopted cousins, I had adopted classmates from kindergarten all the way through graduate school. And I never once, not until I met David Rosenberg, did it ever dawn on me to ask, why do you know so many adopted people? Why can you name off the top of my, I can name probably 10 adopted people from Kimmy Ellison all the way to Mary Minette, a roommate in college. And it didn't ever dawn on me. And then when I met David Rosenberg, and he said, I hope my birth mother sees this. Around that same time, Philomena, in the interim years between my meeting David and his reuniting with Margaret, the movie Philomena had come out, and I watched the movie first, and then I read the book, and then it really, it kind of sunk into my marrow that this was a huge phenomenon during that time. It didn't just happen in cold, moralistic Ireland. It also happened here. And I started doing some due diligence, the research to find out, okay, just how big were the numbers? What was going on, and why? And the whole sex ed history, the whole, lack of birth control, the whole, bubbling up of the sexual revolution that we don't think about. We think about the 1950s and early 1960s as this incredibly chaste period. Well, it wasn't true.
Okay. Can you talk about, and you have mentioned that there were problems in all of the agencies, not just in Louise Wise, but can you talk about the people who you think were the real villains at the Louise Wise Agency and the experiments that you talk about in the book, and put some of that into a Jewish context? Here we were in post World War II, post Holocaust, and these were Jewish people, where we, I think, expect to have a fairly high moral standard. Can you talk about the things that really went wrong from an ethical standard where these babies were concerned?
Yes, so Louise Wise positioned itself basically in the nation as the premier adoption agency, certainly the top Jewish adoption agency, but a premier adoption agency that whose practices could be mimicked throughout the rest of the country. And they did this by promising couples that they had the best methodology for matching an infant to an adoptive couple. And one of the reasons that this was going, one of the reasons for that was because adoption was still hush hush. People didn't like to talk about it. It was still, there was a lot of stigma surrounding it, and stigma for having to need to create a family this way. And Louise Wise promised that they could give you a child that would both look as if it was a child who had come to you through biology, but also that it would be matched with you intellectually. And the villains at Louise Wise, in my opinion, there were several. One was the daughter of Louise Wise herself, whose name was Justine Wise Polier, who owned the agency in the years after the war. Louise Wise died, the wife of the rabbi. Stephen Wise died in 1947, and she took the reins just as the demand for infants, the adoption boom, was really skyrocketing. So she was both a family judge and an adoption agency owner. So she was working completely at odds with a massive conflict of interest. She was ruling on some of the very cases that with which her agency was involved. So right out of the box, that's a terrible conflict of interest. But secondly, secondly, there were two physicians on the board of, well, there were two physicians on the board of directors, and there was a forensic anthropologist. Two physicians. One was a child psychiatrist who was on staff at Columbia University, named Viola Bernard. She was directly responsible, regardless of what you may have learned from the movie about the triplets. She was the mastermind of the experiment that separated identical twins and triplets to see if which had a greater emphasis over the course of a child's life, nurture or nature. So she was number one. Number two was a pediatrician by the name of Samuel Karelitz, who believed that intelligence was matched, that a way to measure an infant's intelligence was through his or her cries. And a way to gauge that with a 10-minute-old baby would be to snap the bottom of a newborn's foot with a very, very, very thick rubber band, like the kind you would see on a pile of mail that gathered at the post office during vacation. So this experiment that was funded by the United States government for 15 years actually paid a series of researchers to pull this thick rubber band from a gun, shoot it at the baby's foot, and measure his or her cries. And that experiment endured for not only 15 years, as I said, but on each subject's foot for at least 3 months. And an adjoining researcher would measure the decibels of these cries, and then the child would be tested in rudimentary intelligence tests as soon as he or she hit toddlerhood. So the Jewish aspect of that, when I discovered the rubber band studies, I was so horrified. I couldn't believe what I was holding in my hands. Anybody with $34 who wants to download them from ResearchGate can do it. And once I became aware of them, I just downloaded all of them in one day, and I had a pile of studies with these rubber band studies called induced crying studies. I felt sick, and I didn't know quite what to do. So I thought about it. I was appalled. I felt sick to my stomach. And I made an appointment with my rabbi to go see what to do about it. Because as a Jewish person, I was horrified. I couldn't believe that we had done this to our own people, our own babies, our own tiny babies, our own future. In the years after the war, specifically, the United States signed the Nuremberg Code in 1947, which established the need for informed consent. 10-minute-old babies don't have anybody's informed consent. The adoption agency, the Jewish adoption agency, were the custodians of these babies, and they signed off on this series of experiments for 15 years. I was never able to get an answer for why. I talked to a bioethicist at NYU, a guy named Arthur Kaplan. You probably see him in the news all the time. He couldn't explain it. The only thing we could think of is that somehow the justification for these experiments made by Jewish physicians on Jewish infants was that, well, we're doing it in a hospital, and this is not in a concentration camp. This is a hospital. This is in a hospital setting, and we got funding from the United States government. It has to be okay. That's pretty circular logic, but that's the best I could come up with.
I know there's a comment on the chat from Larry Pittenger that says they believed they were operating in the best interest of the child. And I think, you know, I work in a hospital today, and we have what's called an IRC, an institutional research committee, where things have to be approved by a committee. And I don't think they had such a thing then. And of course, the mothers were out of the picture. So these children were the wards of the agencies. But there were a lot of experiments done that today we would look at with horror. And I certainly think that was one of them.
I think I absolutely concur. And I wonder, were they doing this for the best interest of the child? Who would intentionally harm and hurt and inflict pain on a 10-minute-old baby? And, you know, I didn't say this, but I do say this in the book. Subsequent tests, subsequent rubber band snaps were meted out when the babies were they had been withheld food, and they were cold, or they were especially miserable. So I don't think it was for the best interest of the babies. I think it was for the best interest of the agency.
Okay. Let's go back to Margaret's story for a little bit. Did you discover and did David discover commonalities between himself and his siblings, other than his sister, who was an opera singer, and of course he was a cantor? Were there other commonalities that, I know there was a very short window there of 3 months before he passed away, but did he have an opportunity to discover any commonalities between himself and his siblings?
Yeah, another huge one was the athleticism that he had. David was, his adoptive parents were cantors, Romanian Holocaust survivors who were extremely cerebral, thoughtful. They each spoke, which is not to say that Margaret and George were not thoughtful, but they each, as refugees from that part of the world, they each spoke multiple languages: Hungarian, Yiddish, Russian, I forget what, a Czech probably, Romanian. So they were polyglots and scholars, and very devoted to Jewish education and Jewish thought. And George Katz was also raised in a traditional Jewish home, but he was a major athlete. He got a baseball scholarship as a kid growing up in Upper Manhattan. And David, growing up in the Rosenbergs, left New York when David was about 6 or 7 to go to Toronto. And the first time David picked up a hockey stick, he didn't put one down the rest of his life. And he was drafted by the Rangers. Oh, this is another thing. So not only the athletic ability that David had, David was drafted by the Rangers, which was George Katz's favorite sports team. And David didn't accept the draft, being a draft pick. It just didn't, it really wasn't fitting for a Jewish guy to, I think he lived in Israel at the time. I think, or maybe he was about to make Aliyah. His mother lived in Israel. Esther Rosenberg lived in Israel, and it didn't quite square. But yeah, so those were big commonalities. The other thing, the arcade that I mentioned, George loved games. He loved poker. And David played poker every night with his buddies, and not every night, I think Thursday night with his buddies. So there were a lot of commonalities that just came out of nowhere, seemingly. And yet there they were. And food tastes and and a kind of outsized love of donuts that David shared with George Katz. I mean, a lot of people like donuts, but I think it was even this. It was a chocolate glaze or something like that. To have those, though, to learn about those similarities or those desires, and to know that they might come from somewhere was really remarkable for David at the end of his life.
Well, I do think there is something to be said about genetics not being denied, even in the smallest ways. Um, a question from Susan Seferis. Why do you think David waited so long after both his adoptive parents were gone to find out about his ancestry?
Well, first of all, DNA wasn't really a thing. Direct to consumer DNA tests were not really a thing until the probably 2012, 2013, something like that. They weren't really popularized. Ancestry was the first one, and that was run by the Mormons. And people kind of, it was like that was for those people. And it really wasn't about connecting people and um, connecting potential uh, uh, um, cousins or adopted people. That was something that was an outgrowth of the popularity of 23andMe. So that was one thing. The other thing is that David was curious about wanting to find his family just around the time that he was that his wife Kim Danish Rosenberg was pregnant for the first time, but the system in New York State was completely sewn up. It was utterly secret. And when he consulted a cousin about it, his adoptive cousin, the cousin's inquiries were that, well, you can sign away for this registry in Albany, but you're going to need the approval of your adoptive parents. By that point, David was in his early 30s, and his adoptive parents were dead.
Hmm.
But the infantilization, the message to adoptees that that it continues to today, that their stories don't matter, is something that adoptee rights activists continue to hammer away at in almost every state. So just think about that, Susan. You know, the message to a 32-year-old man who's about to become a father: oh, you're going to need permission. There's a registry that you can see if your birth mother has signed up for, but you can only put your name in if you have written permission from your adoptive parents. It's
Sort
crazy.
of, sort of connected with that, can you talk a little bit about um, what Margaret went through and the efforts she made to find him as Alma began and her secretly going to New York? Can you talk about that? Because I thought she never stopped looking for him. She did everything she could.
She, Margaret became aware of adoptee rights activism in the late 1970s, and she waited until all of the parents were dead. Her own mother, who was brutally disinclined, just brutally cruel to Margaret when she found out that she was pregnant, and to George's father, who was similarly furious about the whole enterprise. She waited until all of the parents were dead, and then she looked in earnest to try to find her son. The index of his birth, which is a long, complicated story, she was able to do that, but she was not ever able to find out anything about his actual adoption because of the lies that the adoption agency had told her. David, her son, was not adopted the next week by a diplomat. He wasn't adopted until he was 2 years old by the Rosenbergs. So she wasn't looking in the right place. And finally, when David, around the time of David's 20th birthday, she thought, that's it, I've had enough. I'm gonna go give my name to the agency myself. I'm going to no more middlemen. I'm going to go give my contact information to my son. He's an adult. He's 20 years old. If he wants it, it's time for him to be able to access who we are. She didn't want to interfere with his life. She didn't want to surprise him. She didn't want to, pop out of a car and say, "Oh, I hired a private eye. I know who you are. I'm your mother." And by the way, a lot of people do that, and you can understand the desperation of a parent to want to know, is my child okay? But she still tried to do everything the right way. She dressed herself up. She put her curlers in her hair. She put it on her best pantsuit. And in the December of 1981, she went to Louise Wise herself, went up the steps of the townhome where it was on the Upper East Side, rang the doorbell, and was told 4 times to go away. And finally, she was threatened once again, just like the social worker who threatened her with juvie. The secretary at Louise Wise in December of 1981 said, "If you don't leave now, we're calling the cops. You're trespassing." And at that point, she crumpled into a ball, started crying, began weeping tears that she had not wept for probably since she had been forced to surrender the papers. And after that, she just turned her desires to find her son over to God. She's a woman of faith and prayed. She said the Shema every morning when she woke up, and said the Shema every night before she went to bed, and hoped that somehow those prayers of safety would reach God's ears and ultimately to her son.
And she did ultimately go to the New York City Library. Can you talk a little bit about how she finally found the birth certificate?
Well, she didn't find the birth certificate.
There was a number she had to
There was a
find.
number that New York City alone is pretty unique, actually. New York City alone has what they call a birth index, that each baby, one of my daughters was born in New York City. I'd have to look and see what her index number is, but they have an index number that was the one clue. If you were born in New York City and you did want to try to seek your birth family or vice versa, you could go to the library and find this 4 or 5 digit number that was on the end. It was on the end of the actual birth. It was just a line in a gigantic binder. Margaret knew the time of birth. She knew the date of birth. She knew where she'd given birth. She knew the county of birth, which was Staten Island, Richmond County. And she was able to go to find this number that then would have matched that same 4 or 5 digit number, would have also been present in some form on David's adoption certificate. But again, because of the secrecy, she tried to find, how did she try? She wasn't able to go any further. Oh, she looked for adoption records, but those would have been sealed. But because of the secrecy laws, let's just put it this way, because of the secrecy laws that existed in New York State from 1935 until 2019, she was utterly unable to ever try to seek those documents for herself. Likewise, David would have been as well. New York adoptee rights activists are among those in only 10 states that have fully opened their records up to adoptees, that fully grant adoptees the rights to access their original birth certificates. So some of the big states, California, Texas, Florida, still completely locked up in that same secretive system that I mentioned early on.
Which takes us to a question by Sandy Epstein. Why is there no uniform adoption law throughout the United States? What's your take on that?
because it's a states' rights issue, just like we have with gun laws or marijuana laws, or um, in some states, to get a divorce, you have to, I think you have to wait a year. In others, I mean, think about Nevada, you can get a divorce overnight. So it's simply that it's a states' right issue.
I don't know if there's anything else in the chat, but there is another question here from Neil Weizenkorn. And I will check the chat in a minute. Closed versus open adoption. Of course, people have seen open adoption as a great step forward, as we talked about a little bit. Neil is saying, I know of an instance where the adopted child, now an adult, has absolutely no desire to meet his biological parents. What is your opinion about having a situation where the adult wants no contact and has no desire for any knowledge of those that gave him up for adoption? And I imagine, Neil, that you meant versus the parent might want to make contact with the child.
Yes.
Okay.
That does happen. That does occur. Just as there are some birth parents who don't want to be found, but it's not the norm. The research shows that the overwhelming body of research shows that most adoptees are curious. They do seek. They do want to know. Often they wait. There's a pretty rigid gender imbalance. Women are far more curious earlier than men are. Women, especially around the time of a big milestone of marriage or a first pregnancy, they really become very curious about wanting to know the circumstances of their own births. They can identify with their mothers. They try to imagine what may have happened. They want to know the origin story. And that happens oftentimes for men when they go through milestones as well, when they become fathers, when they age. There's curiosity that sort of bubbles up at different periods of time. But yeah, sure, there are people who don't want anything to do with their birth kin. I mean, it's not unheard of. It's I don't have any hard data on it because adoptees typically they're not well studied. The studies we do have, there are a lot of them from England, and there are some studies in the United States but I will say this, the research that we have from England is that the vast majority of people do want to look, and they feel both birth parents and adoptees feel much better once they do know. Doesn't mean they have to have an ongoing relationship. It's just they feel better knowing.
Can you tell us a little bit about how David's children and Margaret's children reacted to and dealt with the fact that Margaret and David reconnected shortly before he died, and whether the families are still in touch, etc.?
Well, there are.
I guess the sibling, I guess you would say the cousins.
Yeah.
Are
Well,
they still in touch?
keep in mind there were 52 years of not knowing each other. And there are 3,000 miles of separation. David's family lives in Portland and Margaret is in New Jersey. I know they are in touch routinely. And also it's been pandemic. They are in touch on social media. I think they call each other for birthdays. They text, they share information. There's a warmth there, but I think it's hard to, especially since the person they had in common is no longer with us. The glue for that is a little bit difficult. There's certainly love and compassion, but I think it's kind of hard to bridge a half century of separation.
Julie Warshawski put in the chat, how did David find his mother? We did talk about that, Julie, in the beginning. It was through Ancestry, right? No, I'm sorry.
23andMe. Yeah, David.
23 and Me.
Yeah, David was given that for a birthday gift, and it led him to a distant cousin who then did a search to who was able to locate Margaret miraculously within 3 weeks.
Pretty impressive. Can
Yeah.
you tell us a little bit about, I know you're working on something about women who are being trafficked, you said? Or did I
Well,
misunderstand you?
No, you didn't misunderstand me. At the moment, I'm working on one outgrowth of this book was that when the demand for white babies was so great, it was about 10 to 1 that 10 couples waiting for every white baby. One thing that came out of that is that a lot of American Indian children were wrested from their tribes and really just stolen and plopped down in specifically in East Coast families because they were furthest. There were far fewer indigenous people on the East Coast by the early 1960s, late 1950s. So I'm working on a documentary that takes a look at that takes a look, and then it's going on to take a look at the legacy of Native American boarding schools, but we're cooking up a bigger project that will look at a lot of different aspects of adoption through film, through documentary film. So I can't say too much more about the trafficked women right now.
Okay. Are there any other questions in the chat that I missed? Susan, do
Yeah,
you have?
Allison, there was an earlier one about the 3 identical strangers. The questioner was saying, did you see it?
Yeah.
That would be about the 3 boys that were separated before.
Yeah, I alluded to that. Also, the mastermind of that experiment was the psychiatrist I mentioned at Louise Weiss. Viola Bernard was her name. And yeah, I saw that very disturbing film.
Was the film accurate?
It omitted an enormous number of details. I was not a fan of it. I was not a fan. Yeah, I thought it was very sensationalistic and looked at many of the, it sort of wanted you to put your eyes set to turn your gaze toward very sensationalistic aspects of the boys' reunion and didn't really examine the trauma of their separation or the diabolical aspect of those. I mean, it did look at the diabolical aspect of the experiment, but they also, because I'm talking too much about that, but the Viola Bernard, it was Viola Bernard's, it was her brainchild. She loved that experiment, and she doesn't even appear in the film. And the reason why is because in documentary, you need you need as much audio visual documentation as you can. And they happen to have audio of her partner, a partner she brought along to co-author that experiment with her. And he's the only person mentioned. His name was Peter Neubauer, and you hear his voice. He had a very thick Viennese accent, but yeah, there was a lot that was omitted. So that enraged me. That's my history part. That's the history part of me. I was enraged. To be honest with you, I wanted to throw a zucchini at the screen when I saw that.
There were several people in the chat who commented, and I'm assuming since they put it in the chat to everyone, it's okay to say it because anyone can see it. Roberta Bueland said to everyone, my 2 sisters and I could not have children, so we adopted 6 children among us. Congratulations. I think that's a wonderful thing. You know, I trying to see if there are any other comments like that. Here's another.
I just put it in there because I wanted to talk about the other side of Gabrielle's book or themes, just so that people know that, you know, some adoptions are so successful. Children don't want to know, but my son did. My son didn't want to know, but his birth mother really worked hard and managed to get the papers that were sealed in California opened and found him. And we moved around a lot. So she must have had a very good private detective. And we are all in touch. And I had the opportunity to meet her. And I'm a writer, and I've been writing family memories and stories. And I couldn't write my son's story. I mean, I knew the whole story, but once I met her, I sat down and typed 15 pages of his life, because it just was a missing piece psychologically for me. So my sisters and I have had very good experiences. And one of my nephews says, why would I want to meet somebody who gave me up? So he was never interested. I think my niece might be. She's having a child, their first child, but she had talked about it when she was 18. She never did anything about it. Her mother said to her, maybe when she was a little younger, when she's 18, she's free to do what she wants. And I don't think she's pursued it. So I just wanted people to know that as horrific as all the stories are that you tell as an author and an historian and a documentarian, the side of the adoptive parents needs to be told as well.
Well, I do think, I mean, and Gabrielle, please feel free to chime in, but what I found interesting, Roberta, about what you said was that even for you, meeting the biological mother filled in a missing piece. So that
Yes.
It sounds like sort of for everyone involved, there is a missing piece of the story.
Well, sure. And certainly it affected me without my knowing it. And as for my son, he was the 9th of a blended family. And we don't know the exact reason why he was given up, because we've gotten 2 or 3 stories. The father didn't want a child. Then the mother didn't want a child, or they couldn't afford a child, or some such thing. But he's in touch with most of his half siblings and their families. And I was delighted that they found him. I mean, I wasn't going to go out of my way to try, but it gave my son a lot of closure, and it gave me some closure. So
Thank you, Roberta.
You're welcome.
Gabrielle, is there any takeaway that you would like the audience to have from your book? Any particular takeaway either about David and Margaret or about the history?
Yeah, I would say one of the main things is that this side of the story has not been told in this kind of depth before. So that's why I did want to write this story from the point of view of a birth mother, from the point of view of an adoptee who really, truly loved his adoptive parents. I want to make that clear. And they really loved him. But I wanted to show the walls of secrecy that we established as a country that prevented this from let's just do the math, 4 million birth mothers, 4 million birth fathers, 4 million adoptees, 4 million adoptive mothers, 4 million adoptive fathers, untold numbers of siblings. That's a lot of people. I wanted people to see the other side of this narrative. And that's what I tried to do. And I also, to one other point, someone mentioned that, why would I want to talk to someone who gave me up? That was another really very important point in writing this story. That's what David believed as well. And it's not taking away from the love anybody has that adoptive parents have for their children. David believed that he was given up. He didn't have any understanding at all about what his birth parents went through in order to try to keep him. I don't know what that would have changed. He had a wonderful life with his adoptive parents, but it truly did give him closure at the end of his life to know that he had been wanted and desperately that his parents made desperate attempts to try to keep him. So that's an important thing.
Thank you so much. What I would say to everyone in the audience, I know some of you have some personal stories. If Gabrielle's willing to take a few minutes when we end, we can leave the screen open and you can mention it. But I did want to mention to the audience that I hope all of you will join us on May 19th for our next program, which is the Forgiveness Tour. And then also on July 21st for the book Unstoppable. We're really into nonfiction this year. So Gabrielle, thank you so very much. As I've said many times, I loved the book both times that I read it. I think you are a marvelous writer and an eloquent speaker. And we thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's really been my honor. Thank you so much. And I'm really touched to see so many of you. I really appreciate it. And if anybody wants to reach me, the easiest way, Allison, how do you,
I can put it in the chat, Gabrielle. If you give me your email, I'll put it in the chat right now.
I'll just do it right now. If somebody wants to reach me, maybe this is the easiest way.
Oh, there you go.
There it is.
Yeah, that's I have a lot of email addresses, but that's the easiest. That's one of the easiest. So,
And I do hope that you will get back in touch with us when your next book comes out and perhaps come join us again.
I would love that. I would love that. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Gabrielle.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Right, thank you.
So long. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Fran, I think she left.
Yeah, for those of you who are still on, the reason the program was delayed tonight